Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome. I want to say good afternoon. And I was going to say, Pranav will probably say good morning. Good day is what we're going for, the international greeting for this Wednesday. We're just going to wait a few moments for everybody to just enter the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, it's always really exciting because I can see Pranav can see me. So it's always just waiting for everyone else to join us and seeing everybody jump in. This is very exciting. We've had a look at some of the questions, so thank you to everybody who submitted any of those. We do look at them. We are real humans. We do look at the insight, and we'll be definitely going into some of the juiciest questions that you've submitted here today. So I, for one, am very excited. On that note, I think I'll get started. We're about 2 minutes past. I want to be mindful of time. Every minute that I talk, we're not listening to Pranav and hearing all of his insight and experience. So I'll start off. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our live Ask Me Anything with Pranav Kashyap today. We're going to give you just everything that you need in terms of understanding what it's like to be Pranav, to be a group product manager. My name is Jazz Broughton. I'm a CSM here at Mixpanel, and I'll be moderating the session today. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions that you've posted in Slido, as well as those in the Q&A section in Zoom. So between the both of them, we should be able to get some questions answered. Moving forward a little bit into our housekeeping, there isn't tons of it, but it's really, really important for you to be aware of. We will essentially be looking at the questions during the session using the Q&A widget, which you should see on the bar, but we'll also be using Slido. So there is a link that's just been popped into the chat within the Zoom webinar for you to look into. Slido is great because you'll be able to see other people's questions. Please do not be shy, upvote, add more questions so that I can see the most things prominently. The other thing to bear in mind is that we will be recording the session, so it's being recorded on Zoom, so don't feel like you need to take tons of notes. You can come back and review the recording. You'll be receiving an email with that within the next 24 hours or so you won't have to wait too long. So only scribble down what you really, really, really want to remember straight away. And then also, last but definitely not least, if you're having any issues with the tech, with the audio, click the little icon next to the audio. The sort of left-hand corner's got an icon for a mic. What I find is if you go in there and just adjust your audio output, that should usually solve it. If not, jump in and jump out. But also don't worry if your sound is not working in terms of you being heard, because everybody is automatically muted. The main thing is we want to make sure you can hear us. Absolute worst case scenario, Zoom has a function where you can find out your local number. So that will be in your audio settings. So you'll be able to dial in and listen as though we're a podcast. So those are the 3 housekeeping points that I wanted to go into. But without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Pranav Kashyap, who is Mixpanel's Group Product Manager. Pranav oversees the pricing, growth, and data teams at Mixpanel. He's previously worked on products at Symantec and Microsoft, as well as holding roles at Sequoia Capital. I always find it tough to say that one. And McKinsey. He holds an... Did I say it right?
No, I was saying me too.
It's like Sequoia. It's like phonetically, Sequoia. It's a lot easier when it's written, but hopefully we're all thinking of the same amazing company. So Sequoia Capital and McKinsey, and Pranav holds an MBA from Wharton and completed his Bachelor of Technology at IIT Bombay. Thank you so much for joining us, Pranav. I want to kick things off right at the top with our first question, which is, what is one feature that you're super proud of that you designed and you saw get developed into a product?
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone, and good afternoon. Great to meet you all. So, talking about features that I really liked and worked on all the way. So I would say it's actually a pretty recent one. So we at Mixpanel, and this is true for a lot of companies, there's always this setup moment where you want people to be correctly set up. So whether it's like Facebook with its 7 friends in 10 days. So if you don't get to those 7 friends, you're not going to have a great time on Facebook. And similarly in Mixpanel, you need to start sending data in, and that data needs to be good quality. And that's set up. And then once you get past that, you can really start using Mixpanel. And so one of the issues we were facing is that a lot of people didn't know what good looked like. So, they'd done this before, perhaps, maybe it was not great. They kind of understood what an event was. So what we wanted to do was give people some kind of environment where they could play around with Mixpanel before they even sent in data, also understand what really good looks like, and then use that as an example for their own companies. So we built these concepts of demo projects or demo data sets. So as soon as a new user logs in, they can actually get in there, like start building out reports, play with the data, and like with a bunch of roles and permissioning, no one else can see what you're doing in there. So that's been super exciting for a few reasons. Like one, there were lots of technical challenges along the way, like how do you do authentication? How do you like give people the right kinds of roles and permissions so they don't trip over each other? To build a bunch of new features to make sure that we could freeze time so everyone saw the same data all the time. So again, like lots of cool technical challenges along the way. We came up with innovative solutions. And now, yeah, like I think about 70% of new users actually go through the demo data set before building out their own projects. I'm pretty excited by that.
That's amazing. And thank you so much. I'm so glad that you chose that, because as you were talking, I realized how interesting that is as a product, because most platforms, and you can comment in the chat if you work for an organization that has an internal demo environment, but it's quite a different thing to design something for the end user that is still really helpful and enabling, but still kind of showcasing that best practice without having somebody necessarily walking them through. So curating that experience must have been really, really great. Yeah. Oh, that brings me on really, really nicely to my next question. And this could be quite interesting because, as I mentioned at the top, you're involved in terms of overseeing pricing, growth, and the data team. So that can be quite interesting. I'd love to know which insight from our users surprised you the most, because we are data informed here, right? So I'd love to know what insight you found that was surprising.
That's a great question. I need to think a little bit about really surprising insights. There's been so many. So I think the most interesting insight I found was working with a previous team, which was on messaging. The fascinating thing there was that within a message at any point in time, like the old version did not let you toggle things on and off. And so most people toggle messages on or off from the list. Like there's a list of messages you can say, hey, this one's active, I'm going to switch it off so it's inactive. And one of the things we were doing during the design was to actually like put this in at any step, so you could stop midway through it and like save it as a draft and like say this one's going offline. And I was just a little bit surprised before. So, like I knew from all of the data that people didn't really go into the message and then switch it on or off if it was already on. And so during the design discussion, we're like, no, is this really necessary? And we're like, you know what, let's try it out. And fascinatingly, like that was one of the most used places. So people kind of stopped going into the list, and we just completely missed that fact that they actually would still want to do it. It was just that we made it a little bit harder. We had it on all the way at the very last step versus having it in every step. So yeah, that was like a fascinating user insight. But there's been just so many, like even on the demo data set that I was talking about, what we initially planned was that it was mostly for new users. But we saw that almost 40% of the users of the demo data sets were existing companies who already had their own data. and they still wanted to go look at it and see how they could change. So another fascinating insight.
Yeah, I must hold my hand up here as a CSM. I do tell my existing users and customers about it. It's a great way to build confidence, I guess, to kind of say, look, everything that you see in here, you can do in your own project. So experiment and kind of be free. So yeah,
I have you to thank, guys.
Confession, I've been sending people there. I've been like, have you seen the sample data sets? That's perfect. So making that user journey, it almost feels like a life hack, but it's almost a product hack. It's like, change it. Awesome. So that brings me on to a question that's a little bit more about you as a product leader, implementing strategy, deciding focuses, looking at, what should we build next? How should we build it? And one of the top question, in fact, on the list here we have from Uju is, how do I develop a product strategy that is implementable?
So most of the time, I think when you're building out product strategy, it's a good practice to not think about implementation just yet. I'm kind of assuming, you are a reasonable person who's not saying we're going to send spaceships to Mars by Mixpanel, right? So there is the vision constraint. So visions for most companies are like a 10-year plus vision. So if you think about Facebook, their vision might be to like bring communities together. If you think about Mixpanel, our vision is to provide more answers to more people. And then a strategy essentially is something that helps your company fit into that mission over the next, say, 3 years or so. But one of the things I find useful is to not have the implementation lens just yet when you're thinking through strategy, because a lot of the times when you bring in that implementation lens, the thinking changes quite a bit. So you're like, hey, I already have this stuff. And then if I was just to add on this new set of features, I could get to this new cool thing. And like, that's going to be my strategy. And typically that leads us to local optima. So yes, like if you were thinking of all the incremental things you could do to your product, that might be the best one. But it would also miss some of these things that seem like harder bets. So remember, like your strategy is probably setting you up for the next 3 to 5 years. And while things look really hard to do in 1 year or do in 2 years, but if you have that 5-year mindset, that compounding growth really gets you there. So I would say, like for the most part, try and broaden that scope and don't bring in the implementation lens until, until the very end, where you're trying to prune out some things and you're like, look, if we had to build this, we'd have to go re-architect our entire system. And so like that's something that would eliminate the strategy. But if this is something like, hey, like we need to spend like 6 months to a year of engineering effort to make this strategy happen, then it might just be worth it in a 5-year time window.
Yeah. So having that combination of that short and long-term vision and trying to find the opportunities, I guess, between those. And that links really nicely to a question that we have here from Mariana. And I love that you put out a 5-year sort of vision looking forward. Mariana's question is, in these unprecedented times, I feel like saying, in the year 2020, where everything is so different and unpredictable, how can we build our product vision in a 2 to 3 year time frame?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think obviously if you're building something out now, it's a lot harder because there's more unpredictability. But I would think about it in different groups of industries. So there's some industries like restaurants, like in-person retail, that have been really impacted negatively by COVID and by like 2020. There's others who've had like significant tailwinds. So if you think about a Zoom or a Slack, a lot of these productivity tools have had significant tailwinds because everyone's working remote. And there's a few which had both positive and negative tailwinds, so kind of stayed roughly flat. So as you build out your product vision, the first question obviously is like, what industry are you in and what industry do you want to continue being in? So there's a great example. There's a podcast called Acquired, highly recommend. They had this example of a restaurant in Seattle, basically, that kind of switched from being like a Michelin star level, like dine-in only restaurant to being like a bagel shop where you could drive in and like pick up bagels. And with that, they had a restaurant booking app, so similar to an open table called Talk. And Talk basically like partnered with them and said, hey, we're going to re-architect our entire like restaurant seat booking system into a takeout scheduling system because, you know, like one, there's no one in that market. Second, we already have like a customer who's willing to partner with us on this. And they did that. It took them like a month or two and they just like re-architected their whole app. So now they schedule pickups, schedule takeout. So that was really fascinating. So I think, yeah, so question one is like, how is your industry affected? Is this like a long-term shift that you expect to happen? In which case, like, should you be completely considering pivoting on your product vision to say, hey, like, no, we're no longer like a in-store restaurant booking app. We're actually now this other thing. So that's sort of question one. And then question two, I would say if you are an established company with a long-term vision that's not super changed by this, really your vision ends up being roughly the same, especially if you're getting tailwinds from COVID, then it's more of a strategy on how do you manage this. So again, for someone like Zoom, right, like perhaps on their like regular trajectory, they had, hey, we're going to build out this feature and this other feature. But now because of these COVID tailwinds, they've had to switch a lot of their efforts from building out features to maintaining performance and maintaining their servers and making sure nothing crashes. So it's less of a vision shift. They're not saying, hey, like we're not going to build out video conferencing anymore. They're just saying our strategy changes a little bit to focus more on reliability. So that's how I would think about it. Yes, obviously much harder to do like a long 10-year vision right now without knowing exactly what this is. But I would say, unless you're planning to completely pivot your business, I would sort of recommend staying the course.
Yeah. And as you were talking, my brain was doing overtime. And I just thought, you know, often in business, there's an element of doing risk, right? Or scenario planning. And I wonder how many organizations have gone, you know, through this unprecedented time, gone into their data to say, you know, if we got more of this type of customer versus this type of customer, what would change or what would need to change internally and externally? And then understanding and looking at that in the same way that we look at, will it crash if we get thousands within 60 seconds? Do you know what I mean? So like having that, I don't know, maybe that's like the new wave of QA roles where it is, you know, testing out if external factors just kind of take us on this tailwind that we weren't prepared for. So I that's a great question. And thank you so much, Mariana, for popping it in. And thank you for your answer as well, Pranav. So one of the most popular questions that we've got here actually is from Fuki, and it is about benchmarking. And this is a great time to ask this because I'm not sure if you all know, we've just released our latest product analytics resource. I'm calling it a resource. It is way more than just a document. It's a great collection of insight. But Fuki's question is, what are good sources of benchmarks using competitors or similar products for performance evaluation?
Cool. That's a great question. Yeah, like as PMs, we're constantly thinking. I mean, we're all competitive people. I get it. We want our products to be the best. So there's a few different places to look at for benchmarks. So obviously, Mixpanel has a great product analytics benchmarks report, which I think might be embedded in the guide to product metrics as well. But this tells you by different industries, you know, like what is the average retention curves, how much engagement do you see, and sort of these core metrics that I found really helpful. And so because it's also organized by industry, it's really applicable, right? Like you wouldn't expect a gaming retention curve to look like a B2B SaaS retention curve. So I think that's a great resource for what I would call like the broad genre of like activity metrics. Then there's other performance metrics, which are more around things like actual UI performance, app performance. And this is where I would go look at a few other companies. Like I think App Dynamics does some of this. They actually track like, you know, how much loading time did you take for your app and so on, which is also a different category of performance. And the last piece, I think a lot of us are curious about things like conversion rates and subscription rates. So There's a lot of VC firms out there. So I know OpenView Partners publishes something like this. KeyBank had a SaaS benchmarks report, but there's several of these that actually talk about the business performance metrics, which are things like your cost of acquisition, LTV to CAC, how different companies are set up, and those kinds of things are like a different aspect of performance. So depending on what exactly you're looking for and where you're trying to benchmark each of these is pretty important to you.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of different resources, I guess. And I guess that's the question, is understanding and tapping into the different platforms that will share this information, this insight related to your industry. So thank you so much for sharing some of those tips. We're getting some really good resources. So the Acquired podcast, right? We need to check out. And yeah, App Dynamics, having a look at what they're putting out in terms of that data. Thank you so much. I'm looking at these questions and we've got some really great ones rolling in. I want to switch gears a little bit to give them the stuff that they for sure can't Google in terms of how we operate internally. So one of the great questions that we have here is how do we structure our teams? How do we structure our product teams at Mixpanel? And then I'm going to throw a part 2 at you in there. How do we communicate as product teams? How do we then communicate with the rest of the organization?
Got it. That's such a good question. I mean, I think our product teams we've evolved quite a bit, and I still don't know that this is the best state. I think it's the best state so far for us at our current, like where we are as a company. But again, like I don't know if this is like a globally optimum state. But Mixpanel kind of started out, and a little bit of a history lesson, just so we can walk you through some of the mistakes we made, so maybe that you don't repeat the same ones. But when Mixpanel started out, our product and engineering teams were kind of separate. So there was like a product team that was like a bunch of PMs, and there's a separate engineering team which each owned different services. So we had like an analysis service, we had a JQL service, we had a messaging service, we had app BP services, and so on. And so there were different engineers who owned each of these, and different PMs who were kind of unallocated free resources. And there would be like an annual planning process, and we'd say, hey, these are the top projects. Here's the engineering team who already owns that service, and so they'll go do this, and they get this PM from the pool, and like this other team gets this PM from the pool. So that was kind of like free market, everyone goes everywhere. So obviously downsides of that were like no one had built up a good understanding of the user. Like everyone had an average understanding of the user, but not like I know every little thing that my user thinks. So anyway, from that we switched to a UI based product team alignment. So now we went from like disparate teams to now having teams focus on a certain part of Mixpanel product. So, we had teams that were like focused on the insights report. There were teams that were doing funnels and retention. There were other teams doing like flows. So that was a different notion, a different setup. And I think that also worked pretty well because, we were able to move really quickly. These teams would not get in each other's way because they were just like touching different parts of the product. The downside we faced there was because of this, and like because everyone was moving so quickly, the designs got out of sync. So like what the retention UI looked like was completely different from what cohorts looked like, which was completely different from what insights looked like. So that made it hard for customers to actually like, have a common experience wherever you are in Mixpanel. So now, since then, we've switched to more of a persona-based model, which is where we are right now. So there's basically a few different people who are personas of Mixpanel. So there's the most important one is what we call the learner. So these are the people who are asking us questions, running queries, building reports. Then there's the implementer, who is the person who's sending in data, making sure it's right. Then there are the admin, the buyer, and those are the different personas we have. So we've now aligned teams based on those personas. So the biggest ones are on the learner, and this is our analysis group. So obviously this is the biggest group because this has the most work to be done. And then separately, we have teams for the admin side. We have teams for the buyer side, which is my team. And then the implementer side, which is a different team that I manage. But that's roughly how we're set up right now. And so far it's been going pretty well, but we'll ask me this again in a year.
Always iterating. I'd
Yeah.
expect nothing less. And I guess the part two of that question
Right.
is how do you communicate internally? You know, I'm in the customer success team. There are other sort of departments across the company that need to be
Yeah.
updated on the changes and the
Yeah.
projects.
Totally. Again, like great question. And I don't know that we've been the best at this. We're obviously always constantly striving to improve. But I want to break up that communication into two pieces. One is just internal communication within the different product teams. And then the second one is communication outside of what we call EPD, or engineering, product, and design. So on the first part, one of the philosophies I really like to follow is, again, like Gibson Biddle. I don't know how many people have heard of him, but he used to be VP of product at Netflix. And he writes a lot now about like product strategy, product team setup, how to set up goals. And, I would highly recommend, again, like checking out his Medium posts.
This has to go out with the recording. We have to do like your top list.
Yes.
I'm writing it down.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. So he talks about tight alignment and loose coupling. So what this means is that all of your product teams are very tightly aligned, in the sense that they each know their own part of how are they moving the company's metrics. And these all fit into like a nice pyramid-like structure where, these are all feeding into those common company goals, but they're also only loosely coupled. So what that means is product team A doesn't need to go check with product team B to make sure that they're doing this, because they don't commonly overlap. So yes, there may be a few things where they need to sort of sign off from each other, but in general, there's like the metrics and the way the teams are structured make sure that they're aligned. And so that is definitely something that is really important. And what that does is like making communication within the product team a lot easier. So now you have a bunch of product managers who kind of know what each other is doing, and they also know what their points of intersection are. So we did this at Mixpanel to essentially map out the different groups and also map out where these overlaps will happen. So now we know, so for example, on the growth team, we know that some of the things we do will impact the new user experience. So whenever we're changing that part of the product, we make sure to loop them in, let them know we're doing this. And that's really happened. That's helped us a lot, because overlaps are unavoidable, but if we know what to expect, it becomes a lot easier to manage that. And then for part two, which is communicating to the entire company and the go-to-market org, we've been through a few different iterations of this. The first one would just be like blast emails. So we'd send out what we call shipped emails to tell people about new features. And then that would go out to the whole company. And then we had a separate process for research and betas. So where we talk to different people about, what we're thinking about. And then the reverse communication, which is from the go-to-market team to the product team, which is also like super critical, because obviously the go-to-market team has the best insights on the customers. That would usually happen through a couple of processes, either like informally just through Slack of, hey, I was talking to this customer, like here's what happened, but most importantly through what we call a gaps system. So we built out like custom objects in Salesforce called product gaps. And so our go-to-market team goes in there and like lists out, hey, this was the customer, this was the problem, this is the category it falls into, and these are the issues they ran into when they were trying to do X. And so that's how we get a lot of information. That's how we as a product team prioritize. And then on the way out, like when we're building products, we do research mostly through one contact on the CSM team who helps coordinate all of that. But all of the new feature releases and feature changes happen through now a mini email and Notion page. So the Notion page is there for posterity. So if there's a new employee who joins, they can always go back and look at those Notion pages to make sure they have all the talking points. But the email is there so that people get alerted to, hey, something's new, because we don't expect people to constantly go check Notion for new things.
Yeah. Perfect. And I love the fact that you brought us along the journey, because from the questions I can see we're all in organizations of different sizes and different structures. I think Mixpanel as a whole, we have just under 300. And in terms of the EPD team, how many people do we have in the EPD team now?
I think about 100 people.
Yeah, so a third of our organization is EPD, and then I'd probably say go to market is maybe another 100. It could be even more. So as we're listening to Pranav walk through how we're communicating and having those objects in Salesforce, this is it at scale. You know, hundreds of people talking to other hundreds of people, having a point person. Me as a CSM, I know who the point person is on our side. Those product gaps are also logged by our support team. I say that to say it didn't happen overnight, and it doesn't mean that if you are in the startup phase or scale up phase that you have to jump towards creating a system like this straight away. But it could be quite interesting for those of you that are in organizations that are now going into remote, where you can't walk up to the product manager anymore. It could be interesting to leverage your tech to get those communication and lines of information going. So this is amazing. You also answered my next question anyway as well, which was around sort of getting the priorities straight. So the product gap system being a great way of getting clarity on essentially what the users want, because it's voice of the customer, it's what they need. And hopefully it's very well scoped out and detailed by myself and my other colleagues.
No, we appreciate all of the
Yeah. The details are great. I'm gonna take you into a fun space. I confess this is not the most upvoted question, but it is up there, and I want your opinion on it, because this is something I see across a lot of SaaS platforms, which is the public roadmap. You know, the email that you get saying, hey, you're a user, you're a customer, we love having you here, click this link to see what we're building. Mm-hmm. What's your opinion on having things like that to communicate to your user base?
Yeah, I think it's a cultural thing. So, you know, as a company, there are some companies who are like super open about everything, you know, from their product roadmap to like compensation to org structure, and, you know, basically everything's public. And there's also companies on the other extreme where you have no idea what's coming down the road, and, you know, like one new feature arrives up on your screen one day. So I'd say that there's no one right answer here. It isn't that a public roadmap will help you or hurt you, and or a private roadmap will do the opposite. But I think where I can be helpful is laying out the pros and cons. So I think with a public roadmap, what becomes really helpful is one, you get a lot of buy-in and a lot of new customer acquisition. So customers who are bought into your vision, who see where you're going. So even though you may not have that feature just yet, they're like, no, this company is doing exactly the set of things that I want them to do, and I buy into this. And so that's a very powerful driver for customers to like your product, to build a following. And it does wonders from that sense, even if your product didn't have all those features. And I think the second big plus is once you've committed to something publicly, it really drives a lot of internal alignment. So we're not sort of constantly second guessing ourselves and saying, hey, what if we do this instead? And it kind of helps to stick with the strategy, stick with the roadmap, and get the whole company bought in. And there's no confusion where someone on the go-to-market team had no idea this new product was being built, and then suddenly it's an email that lands in their inbox. So I think those are all the pluses. But obviously this comes with a set of negatives as well. One is it's a little harder to make changes. So the benefit of a private roadmap is, let's say you build something and you're like, hey, either this is way harder to build than I initially thought it was, or you've built it and it's not really what customers want. Then in the beta phase you might decide, hey, we're going to pull this back and maybe put it on the back burner. And with a public roadmap, that's a little bit harder to do. You can obviously still do it, and the fact that customers can see it and upvote your public roadmap means that you get more positive signal on, hey, this is what we want to do. But the opposite is hard. You can't just say, hey, you know what, that product we told you is coming out next quarter is no longer coming out. And then people would get upset. People may churn from your product. It may sort of destroy that that amazing fan base that you've built. So yeah, I think something that's a middle ground would be great. So things you're very confident are very likely to come out, talking about those. Whereas things that are further out, maybe just not committing to having a product out by then, but at least like talking through what's coming and like where your mind is at is really helpful. And
Yeah.
so I want to think we've kind of done parts of this, not obviously not fully, but we use our Mixpanel community a lot to get ideas, but also give people feedback. So you can submit ideas there and then say, hey, like I really wish Mixpanel had product feature X. And then other people can follow that idea, and like the team, the community team constantly goes in and updates this to say, hey, like this is in consideration, we're thinking about it, or this is in research phase, or we're actually in development on this and like we're building this out. So then you get an update once it actually ships.
Yeah. Yes, having that happy medium. I think that's one thing that has always been really interesting to me is as a customer success manager, we give our users the opportunity to test things. So we don't kind of operate in this sort of black box and we go, hey, voila, here's this feature. We want you to love it off the bat. We go through that process of product development and testing, internal testing, and then we move them into beta, which is where a lot of our customers, or essentially a section of our customers, will be able to speak directly with people like Pranav. So we don't hide our product managers away at Mixpanel. They are very much available and involved and really happy to hear candid feedback through community or during sort of beta testing phases, and then we'll roll it out. So we find that is helpful in terms of a process, and also it means that we can go on to community and say, hey, it's on its way, or it's in testing, or you are not the only person who would love this. So thanks so much for adding your +1. So I would say don't be shy going into QBQ community and posting your ideas, because we're listening.
Yeah, and just to add on, like in addition to that gaps prioritization process, we do look at community to see what people are talking about. So it's definitely a really useful source of information for us.
Perfect. And that brings me on to my next question. And this is, I feel like this is one of the biggest questions for product teams all over the globe, which is you have a finite resource. So you've got a certain number of team members. We all have the same number of weeks within our year. How do you align and connect between product backlog and strategy? So the new and shiny special things versus maybe the not so shiny hygiene optimization. Like how do you approach that in terms of the teams that you oversees, or just Mixpanel in general? I think you can speak for our approach as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And again, no right answer here, but there needs to be a mix of both. So typically, if you end up focusing too much on just tech debt cleanup, that leads you down this pathway where basically you have a really functioning product, but then not a lot of new features. And given how competitive the entire ecosystem is, it becomes really important to have those new features. Maybe 10 years, 15 years ago, when there were no cloud services, it was not easy to set up a new company and get running. Then yeah, like it was probably easy to just like sort of focus on tech debt, just be like, you know what, like we have a nice competitive moat, no one's like coming after our business. But now like there is no business that no one's coming after. So that focus on features and strategy becomes more important. That said, the tech debt portion is also obviously important. So it's usually a consideration of a few things. So one is, what is your relative investment in each of these things? So how much do you plan to invest overall towards your strategic objectives? How much do you plan to invest in efficiency objectives? And that gives you one signal. The second thing, and I think this is probably more important as a driver, is what I want to call like marginal cost of churn. So or marginal churn contribution. Again, like this, it's a broader topic. Highly recommend Shishir Mehrota. He's the founder of Coda, and he's put out some articles on this where he talks about this in the context of a subscription bundle. But I think a lot of those same concepts apply to product management as well. So when you think about what is your marginal contribution to churn, are customers churning because your product is not performing efficiently? Are they churning because they miss a feature that you should be building? And that really helps you drive up or drive down your investment in each of these things. So if you find that most people are like churning because they're missing these features, or they're missing this thing that your product doesn't have, then like features is probably the right thing to go focus on next. Whereas if it's like like you don't have good performance, or this thing crashes, then you need to go focus on reliability, go focus on cleaning up some of that tech debt. So I think that's the customer signal. The second thing is, as you PM more and more, you start seeing these patterns. So like one of my teams manages the billing system at Mixpanel, which unfortunately is a completely bespoke, like home-built billing system. And as we sort of go through different cycles, I can see that a lot of stuff keeps breaking on that. Like we launched our EU data residency project, and then like the billing system didn't know about it, didn't like go calculate tallies for those projects. And so we had a lot of these issues keep coming up. And so that's when hey, like we probably need to spend like a decent chunk of time just fixing the billing system and making sure that it's sort of up to date, because you can see that drag on every other new feature you build. So we want to build, like we switched from events to MTUs a couple of years ago, but the amount of effort that took because of our billing system was probably like 2x. Like if our billing system was a little bit better, maybe we could have done it in half the time. And so once that metric shifts, so like when you're getting to your projects take 2 times as much, or like 50% longer because of all the tech debt, that's again like a second good indication of like, hey, maybe we should go clean up some of this thing and pay down that tech debt.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a rebound. Again, I told you all at the top of the session, I'm a customer success manager. So in my head, I'm like, it's like growth v retention. That's my equivalent of this this dilemma. And it's intrinsically linked, because ultimately it's about understanding what our users want. There are some users that we speak to that are like, I need it faster. And there are others that are, they need something new. They need more of their own internal process gaps filled, because that's ultimately what it is. We do have a question here around the whole dilemma of when you're strapped for resources, engaging external platforms and things like that. Which actually brings me along to another question just around using Mixpanel. This isn't Ask Me Anything, but you've been involved in so many of our product teams, and we have some questions on here around how to strategically approach it. So there's a question around having a focus metric and how do you connect that to your KPIs, and I guess I'll adapt that question a little bit to say, what's your advice, when you're creating a product analytics strategy in general? What are maybe 2 or 3 pieces of advice you have for people?
Yeah, so I'd say one is start from your company's vision and mission when you're crafting that strategy. So, making sure it's fully aligned so that you're not going off and building things that are not fully aligned, and, it's a waste of time and it confuses your customers as to who you are as a company. So that's sort of step one. The second is, as you think about metrics, there's generally some kind of business metric you're also focused on, right? So, and this is where your specific business model becomes more of an important driver. So if you're a SaaS business with repeated revenue, you want to see a certain revenue retention rate or an ARR growth rate, and that's what your company is trying to focus on. If you're a transactional company, so like eBay, then maybe what you're focused on like is the GMV of your marketplace and like getting people to do more transactions. So, and then if you're something like Facebook, then you want people to spend more time in your product and looking at things, sharing things. So step one is like, what is that overall metric you're trying to move? And then how does that tie to your strategy? So there's that piece. So making sure that your strategy as a product team ties well with the business metrics that your company is focused on. So typically product teams don't have revenue metrics, just because we want product teams to think about customer experience, customers first, and not have to worry about like, hey, is this going to make money? Is this like driving more dollars? So we consciously try to keep them away, but at the same time, like someone needs to make sure that what the product team is building is aligned with getting more revenue, is aligned with better retention. And that's typically a more senior person in the product org.
Yeah.
So that's step 2 in the strategy. So making sure your overall focus metric, so your product focus metric, whether it's weekly active users, or it might be like weekly active riders or transactors, and that metric ties well with your company's overall metric. So I think that's step 2. And then the third is that usually one metric is never enough. So when you try and come up with like that one perfect metric that works for everyone, people will always have these questions like, hey, what if I game it this way? And like, what if I do this? And our typical reaction to that is to complicate the metric and say, oh, it's not weekly active riders for Uber. It's actually weekly active riders that have spent more than $10. Oh, but like, what about our biggest population is people going to their offices, let's say in a pre-COVID era. It's like, okay, no, it's just like weekly active riders spending more than $10, traveling during like 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. or 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And so this keeps getting more and more complicated. And then, it's basically not useful. So what's really helpful is like having that overall focus metric, which in general, like if you assume everyone has good intentions to moving this metric, then that metric going up means that your company is doing well. But also having a set of supporting metrics. So what we call level 1 metrics, which look at how is your reach going? Like how many new people are you getting in? How many people are you resurrecting? How is your retention? How is your activation rate? And also any other business specific metrics. So, what is your data center spend? Like that's a metric we look at Mixpanel to make sure that, we don't spend too much on data center costs. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, Jazz.
Yeah, I'm already like, yeah, am I doing this? Am I thinking of it in this way? Because it can be such a huge thing, and we do encourage all of our customers at Mixpanel to have a framework in place or some sort of structure to guide how they're interacting with the information that they see in the Mixpanel project to turn it into insight and something that is actionable. We believe we create a product that's biased towards action.
Yeah.
So that's a huge way of doing it. We've got like a few more questions here, and I'm scanning through because I want to ask you the best. I feel like we've covered so many, but we have one more. I think we've got
actually, Jazz, before we go there, one thing I wanted to add on to the previous question is the connection to Mixpanel. One of the things, one of the traps I've seen people fall into is kind of starting to track data without yet having their focus metrics or their company strategy in place. And that leads to that same incrementality we were talking about, like in the beginning of this AMA. So I think having that strategy and saying, hey, look, we care about weekly active riders. And so let's track every ride to make sure that we're able to track this metric becomes really important versus like saying, hey, I want to track this button click and this scroll and this image. And so that leads to more chaos than actually helping drive product strategy. So this less is more in a lot of cases.
100%. I always get the metaphor when I'm working with customers on this. It's almost like the metaphor of going shopping, and not just any shopping. I'm talking like Costco shopping without a list. You end up spending too much. You forget what you came in here for in the first place. It's been a stressful experience. You get a little bit lost. If you are a family person, you've probably lost one of your children down one of the aisles. I'm taking you through this really painful metaphor of just not going with a plan. You still come out with things, so don't get me wrong, you can still use Mixpanel. It's just the experience won't be what we want it to be for you. So thank you so much for adding that on. It's so valuable. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to bring it back to you personally. As I mentioned at the top of our time here, you oversee pricing, growth and data teams here. What is your focus for the final months of 2020?
So it's a good question. There's like, so each of these teams is managed by a different PM. So I guess I'm a little bit removed from this, but my main goal for the remainder of this year is to get more set up accounts or activated accounts. And what we call activated accounts are accounts that have sufficient amounts of data in them. They have people in them who are building things. And obviously that they've set up an account with Mixpanel. And honestly, I don't care if they're like free accounts or paid accounts, but that is something that I'm really driving towards. And that's why all three of those things that I'm looking at, so pricing, growth, and data. So the pricing is just all about how do we make the price sufficiently attractive so that people can actually say, hey, yes, Mixpanel works for me. I'm willing to pay for this. It's not going to break the bank. And we want to keep it that way, right? Like we don't want to be your biggest line item spend. The second is on growth, which is all about how do we get more people into Mixpanel? How do we make it easy to sign up? How do we give you a demo data set to play with so that you know what you want to do? And then the last piece is around the data side, which is data quality. How do we make sure that once you log in, once you've set up your account, you actually know how to send data in, you know what to track, and you can keep it at like a high quality. So those are the three things. And so overall, what that metric boils into is like, how many setup accounts can I get into Mixpanel? But that's roughly how it breaks into each of my teams.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Oh, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank you so much, Pranav, for being so open, transparent. I was able to, some people use the phrase pick your brain, but I prefer tour your mind as a product leader. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us and submitting the questions. If we didn't get to your question, please don't worry. We'll be sending the recording out after within the next 24 hours. And if you just hit reply to that email, we'll be put in touch to get you an answer to that. So we are here to support, and you can join the QBQ community if you've got ideas, feedback, any questions that you want to continue to ask Pranav, because he's in there as well. Please do. But thank you so much for everything.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. This was super fun. And Jazz, thanks so much for moderating. Those were such great questions.
Yeah, then I can't even take the credit. I looked at the slider, I was like, boom, what do I start with first? So thank you to everybody who registered. Hopefully see you on the next one.
Absolutely. See everyone. Bye.
Thanks everyone.